Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, I shall review what we talked about in class regards to the skeletal system. Now, the skeletal system, contrary to what you might think, is actually quite complex. It's just not like dead bones or anything like that. Far from. In general, you can say it has four important functions, and here they are. One, it protects the organs. It protects internal organs. For example, the rib cage, of course, protects the heart, and also the lungs that are right behind over there. Also, the skull protects the brain. So, one of the very important functions of the skeletal system is that it protects internal organs. Secondly, it offers support and flexibility. It is the flexibility of the joints that allows us to do many great things. So, the mobility and the flexibility that the skeletal system allows, at the same time protecting the internal organs, is what makes it so especially unique. And thirdly, the skeletal system is where blood cells are made. The red cells, the white cells, and platelets, etc., that are in the blood, they are made in bones, in fact, in the bone marrows. It is typically the long bones, such as over here, the femur and the pelvic bone, and the humerus over here. It is typically in the marrow of these long bones, or these big bones over here, that the blood cells are made. And finally, skeletal system acts as a storage place for calcium, and calcium is a very important mineral for the body. So these are the four important functions of the skeletal system. It protects internal organs, it offers support and flexibility, it forms the blood cells, and also it's a storage place for calcium. The skeletal system can be divided into two parts. The axial skeleton, it is like the axis or central skeleton, which includes the skull, the rib cage, and the spinal cord. So the skull, the spinal cord, and the rib cage constitute the axial skeleton. And everything that's attached to this axial skeleton is called the appendicular skeleton. The term appendicular or appendix, for example, for appendix to a book, is what's attached to the end of the book. The appendix is attached to the colon. So something that's attached is appended. So the appendicular skeleton is what's attached to the axial skeleton, and it constitutes the upper and the lower extremities. So here the clavicle, scapula, and the upper extremities, and over here the pelvic bone, which is equivalent to this bone over here, and the lower extremities. These are the components of the appendicular skeleton. So when studying the skeletal system, we divide it into these two parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. In regards to bones, there are many different shapes of bones. These are just some samples. Here's an example of a very long bone. This is the humerus that's in the arm. By the way, this is the arm, this is the forearm, this is the wrist, and that's the hand. So arm, forearm, wrist, and the hand. So the long bone that is demonstrated here is from the arm. So this is an example of a long bone. In the wrist, there are some 9 bones that allow the great mobility and flexibility of the wrist in different directions. And these have some very interesting shapes. This over here in front of her chest is the sternum. It's in fact 3 bones in one. And this is an example of a flat bone. The vertebrae over here is a very interesting and a very irregularly shaped bone. The particular shape of a bone is dependent on its functions, and all of these bones look the way they do because they serve some specific purpose. The spines of the vertebrae here, for example, they serve as attachment points for muscles of the back. So bones come in many different shapes and sizes. Now, how many bones do we have in the body? Do you know? Well, the number of bones that we have as adults is different from the number of bones that we have as babies. Babies have more bones. Some of them, for example, like here in the skull, they fuse over time and they become like one big bone. As adults, we have some 206 bones. How are bones formed? Well, bones start out as cartilage models. If you touch your ear, that's cartilage. So bones start out as cartilage. And then what happens is certain areas of the bone mineralize or form bony tissue. These are called ossification center, that is, bone-forming centers. So initially the bone-forming centers or ossification centers occur like over here, for example, in this particular bone. And then other ossification centers or bone-forming centers occur. And finally, in the end, the bone looks something like this. When the bone has matured, there are only 3 places really where the cartilage remains. One is at both ends of the bone, in this case, where it acts as a smooth surface where the bone can slide on across the joint. The two other places is right here, and these are called epiphyseal plates or growth plates. As the individual grows, they don't grow from the ends of the bones, they grow from here, the epiphyseal plate. So growth occurs here in the epiphyseal plates. So during the early teenage years or so, when the child grows, they grow taller because new bone is added in this area. When the growth is completed, the epiphyseal plates no longer exist. The entire bone is mineralized and the individual cannot further grow. Now we're going to take a brief survey of some of the bones in the body. The collarbone is called the clavicle. It's one of the most frequently broken bone in sports injuries, etc. So collarbone here is called the clavicle. Now this cartoon representation here is of the sternum. It doesn't really actually look like this. And of course the ribs, we have 12 pairs of ribs, 12 on each side. And these are the vertebrae that protect the spinal cord. These are the pelvic bones. That's the sacrum. And here's the tailbone. The tailbone is called the coccyx. So the clavicle, sternum, ribs, vertebrae, pelvis, or the pelvic bones, the sacrum, and the coccyx are demonstrated in this picture. Now, our head is made of basically two big type of collection of bones. This part of the head, that's called the cranium, and it has a whole bunch of smaller bones. Now, our jaw is the mandible. So a head is made of the cranium and the mandible. As adults, as you can see over here, the skull is a fusion of many different bones. In children, when children are born, these bones have not yet fused. Now the head is attached to the spinal cord by these two very important vertebrae. These are the first and the second vertebrae. Some of the important skull bones that you probably should know are the frontal bone over here, the temporal bone over here by the temporals, the parietal bone over here, the occipital bone over here. This is the bridge of the nose. That's where eyeglasses rest in individuals who wear glasses. This is the maxillary bone over here, and of course this is the mandible. So frontal bone, temporal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, maxillary bone, the nasal bone over here, and the mandible. These are probably some of the more important bones that we should probably be able to recognize. As I said, the skull rests on two very important vertebrae. These are the first and second vertebrae. The first one here is called the atlas. Atlas originates from the name of one of the Greek gods that they believed in, the god that apparently had held the earth on his back. So that's Atlas. So Atlas is kind of like holding the skull on its back. In fact, these two ridges over here is where the skull rests on. Now, the first two vertebrae are very important because they work together. The atlas kind of holds the head up, and the second one over here, the axis, is what allows us to tilt our head, to turn our head from side to side. Because this joint is very interesting between these two bones. It allows us to rotate between the two. So here's the atlas and here's the axis. When they sit on top of each other, the first two vertebrae, the atlas is able to rotate over the axis over here, which is what allows us to move our head from side to side. Now this process over here is called a dance, and that's what it rotates around. By the way, a slight trivia on the side. When people are hanged, it is this bone that breaks and there's blood that accumulates in this area and the person dies. The reason is because the spinal cord over here, the brain stem rests in this right area, and the vital centers of the brain, those that control breathing and the heart, are located right here in the brain stem. And when that gets damaged, an individual really can't survive. So here it is. See how atlas and axis over here. It's the atlas and axis relationship that allows us to move our head from side to side. Okay, allow me to draw something for you over here. This is a side view of the brain. In the back of the brain, this is the cerebellum, which has several functions, most important of that being balance. This allows us to balance. Now the brain, this part of the brain, all these right here, that's called the brain stem. And that's very important because the vital centers are located in the brain stem. The vital centers are the centers that control our breathing and our heart. Survival is impossible without them. So that's the brain, that's the cerebellum, balance, and this is the brain stem. And the brain stem then extends over here, and this will be the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. Now, the reason I draw this is because I wanted to show you the relationship of our skull and the brain. So of course the skull protects the brain, so it's kind of like this. This is a bit of a cartoon picture, of course. Here is the skull bone, so you can see this is the skull, and this is going to be forehead. That's a terrible looking forehead. That's a forehead, and that's going to be the eye socket over here. So the skull protects us, correct? So the brain is inside the skull, but the spinal cord kind of have to leave the skull, correct? So there's an opening at the bottom of the skull right here, which allows the spinal cord to leave. So the skull is kind of like a stone football, but with the hole in the bottom so that the spinal cord can leave. So the brain stem is over here and gives rise to the spinal cord, which leaves over here. Now this hole in the skull, that's called the foramen magnum. Foramen means basically a hole, magnum means big, so it's like a big hole at the bottom of the skull. Now the spinal cord has to be also protected, and hence we have the vertebrae. So if you can imagine like a cylindrical type of a bone like this, okay, with a hole in the middle, that would be kind of like the function of the vertebrae. So there's a hole in the middle, like a cylindrical type of a bone. There's a hole in the middle with the cylindrical type of a bone over here. Right? So if you were to look from the top of this, what I've just drawn for you over here, from the top, it would be like a hole in the middle and bony processes over here. And the spinal cord would be right in the middle of that. That's basically the shape of the vertebrae, but that's not quite it, because the vertebrae over here actually they have a big support bone like this. And on this side, they kind of have spines that stick out of them to allow muscles to attach to them in that area. So in the top view of a vertebrae, it would be something like this. Like that. Okay? So this is what protects the spinal cord. This is what allows us to give us support to the body and internal organs. Now the spinal cord is basically a highway for the brain. Neurons come in and go out of the brain, and they go to the spinal cord like this. So all the nerves are basically highways of the brain. Information goes out of the brain through the nerves, and information comes into the brain also from these nerves. So now you can see the spinal column. And you can see the brain stem over here and the foramen magnum. That's where the brain stem is going to exit the skull. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. The breastbone, as I suggested before, or the sternum, is actually made of 3 other bones. The manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. This tiny little bone that you can actually feel is called the xiphoid process. The heart is located right behind the manubrium over here, kind of like this. And as I suggested also, that we have 12 pairs of ribs. The second rib, in fact, is an important landmark because you can feel this ridge on the chest. So if you feel this ridge, that's where you know the second rib is, and you can count the ribs from there. 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. The ribs, as you can see, are not directly attached to the sternum. There's a bridge, and this is a cartilage bridge, which allows the chest to be mobile and a little bit more flexible. So the ribs end actually right over here, and the rest of the way there's cartilage that connects the rib to the sternum. In fact, the cartilages of ribs number 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, they're all fused together as they go to the sternum over here. The last 2 ribs, right here, 11 and 12, in fact, they don't even come around. They're kind of like dwarf ribs. So again, we have 12 sets of ribs, the second one being an important landmark right here at the junction of the manubrium and the body right here.